in the 1970s and 80s. It had a lot also to do with external other factors of mainstream politics, as well as the influx of weapons due to the Afghan war at some point. So there was a host of other factors that created this, pushed sort of opened up the space for violent interactions on campus. And the banning of student unions did not alleviate that problem, but rather exasperated it, because you now took away the legitimate mode of democratic interaction and voicing of issues that students had till then, right? So it's more about the fact that that students now would then naturally organize along political party lines, mainstream political party lines, rather than also organizing around issues or around their own university-based political debates, which I think is sometimes overlooked in this debate around, or this argument that puts forward that student unions were banned because campuses became too violent.
Exactly. Thank you for highlighting this point, that when you take away legitimate means and channels from students to voice their opinions and their concerns and any problems they may have, convey them to the authorities, then violence is one thing they would resort to. From the audience and participants who've joined us today for this session, any questions you have, please, you can send them in the chat box and unmute your mics and ask also, please. Thank you. I think for now, we don't have a question. And I will...
Well, there's one question I just see in the chat from Hussein, who's asked how we can again start the student union in campuses, especially in Pakistan's contemporary situation. And I think that's something that perhaps is more of a question for student representatives in the audience or in the organizing team, that what are the sort of actual steps that can be taken, right? So we see obviously things like demonstrating, as the Student Solidarity March did, or as many other demonstrations have taken place across Pakistan in different regions and cities, is obviously one way. But what are the other sort of ways to talk about the importance of student unions in Pakistan?
Great, thank you. Now I would hand over the mic to Mr. Arshid, and we can then move on to our next speaker, Jonathan Haber. Thank you very much, Dr. Sadia, for taking out time and for a very interactive and very informative session. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Sadia. It was wonderful listening to you, and definitely we learned a lot of things and listened to some really interesting things about history as well. So now I am going to introduce our next speaker. Mr. Jonathan Haber is an educational consultant, researcher, and writer working in the field of professional assessment, curriculum, standards development, and educational technology. So I will now give his brief biography as well, and the work that Mr. Jonathan Haber has done. Mr. Jonathan's work on massive open online courses has been covered by the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, EdSurge, and other publications, and was the subject of his book, The Essential Guide for MIT Press. He was also the inaugural visiting fellow at Harvard X, recently served as the director of assessment for a new graduate school of education and is currently working with companies and nonprofits on projects related to academic standards and critical thinking instructions. The whole purpose of this webinar is to promote the idea of critical thinking among students and especially the faculty and in the academic areas, so that we as the upcoming future for these difficult times understand that how important it is to think critically and to adopt to these new ideas and to be able to articulate our ideas and to not be afraid to speak of them. So now I welcome Mr. Jonathan Haber, please.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I appreciate it, and I appreciate it. I feel very honored to talk to this group. I've been told of the kind of work you're doing in Pakistan, and I really respect the organization to improve education and critical thinking worldwide. So it's wonderful to be with you. I'm going to share my screen. I think I'm able to do that. Actually, I'm not able to do that yet. So while I'm putting some presentation material up, maybe you could make me the host.
Yes, Mr. Jonathan Haber, I've just forwarded your request and they'll make you the host and then you will be able to share your screen with the audience. So just
Okay.
it'll be a minute. Thank you.
Okay, very good. And while that's happening, I'll sort of zip a couple slides in just to give background. As was described, I am in the US. I'm a researcher who has done work in online learning. A great deal of my work is in the area of online learning previously. Massive open online courses. These were free courses taken by tens of thousands of people in that were provided by universities around the world. My first book for MIT Press was about MOOCs, massive open online courses. Most recently, I've been working, well, really kind of it's an ongoing project, working on critical thinking and how critical thinking can be taught and assessed. As just mentioned, I also have an assessment background. So I think in this talk, I want to kind of present sort of background information on critical thinking, on what it is and how it can be taught, and then kind of go into some of the topics that relate to kind of techniques for teaching critical thinking. So I guess first I will ask, is everybody able to see my screen? It should have a slide with the title of the talk on it. Good, okay. I see a thumbs up, so I'll take that as a good sign. Can't see it, or?
Yeah, we can see it.
Great. Okay. So this is just sort of material I talked. The project I talked about that was mentioned was covered in the New York Times. Was my attempt to sort of replicate a college experience by taking just free courses. That was called Degree of Freedom, and that was my attempt to take sort of 32 online courses in 12 months. That led to MIT Press MOOCs, and then my talk today will be drawing from two books I've written on critical thinking. One is called Critical Voter, that uses election politics to teach critical thinking skills. That's more of a how-to book on critical thinking. And most recent book, also for the MIT Press Essential Series, is less of a how-to book and more about, what is critical thinking and why aren't we doing more of it? I think you see that certainly in politics in the U.S. From the last talk, it sounds like this is an issue certainly for Pakistan, but it's an issue worldwide, right? And I think there are three myths that are sort of standing in the way of improving the increase in critical thinking through population through education. One of those myths is that we think we don't know what critical thinking is, right? We act as if we lack a definition for critical thinking. A third is we don't know how to teach it, or even if it can be taught. And then a third is we have no way of evaluating critical thinking. Critical thinking can't be tested. I call these myths because they are, in fact, we do know these things, or at least we know them well enough to move forward with the critical thinking project. I'll be focusing on the first two, as I generally do with educational audiences, but there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions if anybody has questions on evaluating critical thinking. So, in the book, Critical Thinking, rather than sort of come up with my own definition or synthesizing multiple definitions, I took a genealogical approach to the concept of critical thinking. You know, where did it originate? The whole concept that there's this form of thinking distinct from wisdom and intelligence, it's unique enough to be called critical. Where did that concept originate? And in fact, it's got a long-standing pedigree that it draws from multiple fields that go back hundreds or even thousands of years, most notably philosophy. Important component of critical thinking is logic, but also rhetoric, kind of persuasive communication. Those all trace back to philosophy, particularly ancient Greek philosophy, the work of Aristotle, but also science, especially sort of early modern science that you found in the European Renaissance, and more contemporarily, psychology, education, and cognitive science are all fields that have contributed to the notion of critical thinking. Now, here I should pause, as I do with sort of international audiences, is that critical thinking, I will, have to sort of, as I'll explain next slide, does have an origin point, and that origin point actually is in the United States. So this very much the concept of critical thinking sort of originated in kind of in the U.S. But at the same time, these fields that it draws from, while I certainly would say draw most heavily from the European tradition, certainly in areas of philosophy. At the same time, Aristotle and Plato were sort of creating what's become Western philosophy. You had the Confucian tradition in China, which sort of was a mainstay of political philosophy for many thousands of years. You've got and I hope I pronounce it right, the Vaisheshika tradition in India, which had a very deep metaphysics. And if you kind of go through these fields, certainly the more modern of them, especially cognitive science, emerged during a field of sort of global science and global education. So in the book, I sort of talk about whether critical thinking is something like, scientific laws there to be discovered but universal, or are they cultural constructs that emerge from a Western tradition? And I think the answer is it's sort of probably a combination of both. And again, I won't dwell on it too much on this talk, but I'm happy to talk about it during Q&A, and there are components of this during in the book. So, I mentioned that critical thinking has an origin point, and actually can be traced to 1910, right? It's sort of odd to think that there's a form of thinking you could trace to one date, but in fact, it could be traced to one date, one book, and one person. And that person is John Dewey. I don't know how many people are familiar with Dewey, but he's probably one of the most important public intellectuals in the US in the 20th century. I know the last talk was very much about democracy. One of his most important books was Democracy and Education, where he was a fervent believer in democracy. It was almost a sort of religious faith with him. But he understood that in order for democracy to function, citizens must be able to take on their democratic responsibilities, including the ability to understand the world, understand how to make choices. And in that book, he sort of drew from an earlier book. Democracy and Education was the early 1920s, but in 1910 he wrote a book called How We Think. And in that book, he defined something called reflective thinking as active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusion to which it trends. Now, in the century plus since Dewey, there have been kind of over a dozen, probably closer to 24, different sort of competing definitions of critical thinking. The term reflective eventually became critical, but all those are fundamentally in dialogue with Dewey's original concept of reflective thinking. So now, in terms of definition, as I mentioned, one of the myths is that we don't have a definition that's completely agreed upon, and that's true. Like I said, there's probably a dozen different ways definitions of critical thinking has been worded. So there's no agreed upon wording of what critical thinking is and is not. But there is a consensus you could draw if you read through all these definitions, as many critical thinking educators and researchers agree with. And that is reflected in this three-part model, right? This three-part model is that critical thinking consists of knowledge, skills, and dispositions. Okay, to take one example that I think is not controversial of what should be considered critical thinking, logic, right? The ability to organize your thinking in some way. Now there's different forms of logic, and the critical thinking field doesn't require that you use only one of them. But you really can't be a critical thinker unless you are fluent in some way, shape, or with some form of logic, right? Well, each form of logic has its own rules, and you need to understand, you need to have the knowledge of those rules of logic, right? Whether it's informal logic or some form of diagrammatic reasoning, you need to have knowledge of the rules of logic, right? But that's not good enough, right? Those rules need to be applied in a variety of complex situations, right? When you're having a debate, when you're reading a newspaper article, when you're listening to campaign speeches, when you're making decisions what to do. Those situations are many and varied and can be quite complex. So to apply the rules of logic to them requires practice. Okay, just the same way getting good at a sport or a musical instrument requires practice. So the knowledge needs to be put to work, and that's the skills component of critical thinking. Finally, and this is more contemporary, but I think there's general agreement that one has to possess certain dispositions to be a critical thinker. If we continue on with the sort of logic example, if you know the rules of logic and you're very good at applying them, but you don't do it, or you only apply them to criticize things you already disagree with, you never apply the rules of logic to analyze your own beliefs, for example, then you really aren't a critical thinker. Why? Because even though you have the knowledge and skills, you don't have the dispositions to be a critical thinker. You don't have the open-mindedness, the curiosity, the willingness to examine your own beliefs. So even though there are multiple kind of wordings of critical thinking, I think we could say that there's enough of an understanding of critical thinking represented by this three-part model to move forward with a project of increasing critical thinking through education, right? We may not have a complete airtight agreement on what constitutes critical thinking in terms of wording, but the same could be said with any field, right? Biology has transformed over the last 30, 40 years from a descriptive field to more of a quantitative field with the Genome Project and other things, right? So there's plenty of debate over what constitutes biology, but we're not stopping teaching biology in high school and college till we sort of come to an agreement on a new wording, right? We can move forward with an educational project with a model that's sort of a consensus model, like this three-part model. Now, that said, we need to decide what is the knowledge, skills we need to think critically. And here I would say, there, again, is some discussion and debate on it, but I think there's general agreement that critical thinking does require some form of structure to your thinking, right? Commonly referred to as logic, right? If you can't structure your thinking some way, you can't think critically. But there's other skills as well, right? Most of the things we think critically about are real world issues, either some of the political issues like the last speaker talked about, but even decisions on where to go to college or whether to go to college or whether to take a job or, whether to buy one sort of dishwasher versus another, right? Those discussions and debates and decisions take place in natural human language. So we need the ability to translate that natural human language into structured statements that can be analyzed using the rules of logic. That usually takes the form of an argument. Okay, and I'll be using an argument to illustrate many of these concepts. But argumentation, the ability to engage in it, but also the ability to analyze arguments is a key critical thinking skill. Now, there's a lot of debate, at least in the US, that teaching skills is in conflict with teaching students knowledge. Often in school systems that you find, I think this has been true in Europe, that rote kind of memorization, learning content, not applying it is considered that if you stop to teach things like critical thinking, you're taking time away from teaching content. But as it turns out, content is very, very important to critical thinking, because unless you know what you're talking about, unless you have the background knowledge to talk about a subject, then you can't really think critically about it, right? You can construct very artful sort of argumentative proofs, but if you don't understand the content, then you can't think critically. So in fact, these two are not in conflict, that background knowledge should be considered a key critical thinking skill. Persuasive communication, commonly referred to as rhetoric, is also a critical thinking skill, if only because much of the natural language things we talk about include persuasive elements, attempts to convince you through some of the tricks of the trades of persuasion. So you need to be able to see through those things in order to get to the logic beneath. But also, you know, our logical arguments, the arguments we make, need more than to be kind of logically strong in order to convince people. So it's worth kind of mastering persuasive arts to also be able to communicate arguments and make them effective. And finally, we need to understand and control for biases. The human mind is subject to a whole range of biases, probably the most significant one being confirmation bias, the tendency to accept and believe new information based on whether it conforms to what we already believe and reject it if it does not. So in a way, you could think of critical thinking as a method of controlling for these natural human biases so that we can think more effectively more of the time. Okay, so now again, there's some debate, you know, should creativity be considered a critical thinking skill? And those are very legitimate debates, and I talk about them in the book, and again, happy to talk about them more during Q&A. But I think just using these sort of 6 core topics, we can illustrate how critical thinking is useful to analyze a real world issue. Okay, so I'm going to segue into that example. If you want to read this example. This is something I would say, you know, probably everybody in the world has sort of come up against this in the age of coronavirus, right? You know, here's something that a statement you've probably seen or read something similar to it. You know, we've been stuck in the house for months going stir crazy, and the number of deaths from coronavirus keeps going up. Clearly, social distancing isn't working. Okay, now this is an argument. It's presented in real world language, right? There's, if not a conscious attempt to persuade, there's certainly a passionate element. You could sort of read the frustration in here. So there's a sort of persuasive element that this is a sincere sort of frustration that we're dealing with. Okay, so this is the very type of thing that critical thinking is useful for, right? Now, I should say also, probably many of you read this argument and already agree with it or disagree with it, just based on your kind of own existing beliefs, right? That's that sort of confirmation bias I mentioned previously. You know, this is a simple argument, might be easy to accept or dismiss, but I'd say the critical thinking process we're going to walk through now should be applied agnostically, right? Put aside your initial instincts about this argument, whether you think it's good or bad, and let's go through an analysis. Okay, now the first step in that analysis is translation, right? As I said, this is a real world natural language argument, right? But we need to turn it into something structured that we can analyze. And that translation process needs to turn it into some kind of logical argument, okay? In this case, I'm using a type of argumentation called informal argumentation. Again, we can get into discussions of different types of arguments if you're interested later in Q&A. But in an informal argument, you have premises, okay, which are statements I'm asking you to accept, leading to a conclusion, which is something I'm saying you should or must accept if you accept my premises. Okay, so in this example, I'm saying there's 2 premises in this argument, right? If you strip aside all the passion, if you get down to really the nut of it, it's saying one premise is harsh social distancing practices have been in place for months. And the second premise is during that time, the number of deaths from coronavirus has gone up. Okay, these are 2 statements I'm saying, I'm asking you to accept. I'm asking you to accept them as true. Okay, and then I'm further saying that if you accept these premises as true, then you should or you must accept my conclusion that harsh social distancing practices are not stopping the spread of coronavirus. Okay, so now that we've done this translation, okay, now we could test this argument to see if it's any good. And the first test of an argument is called the test for validity. Okay, and the test for validity is fairly simple, right? The test for validity simply says, okay, if I accept those premises, right? In other words, stop for a moment and ignore the fact if you don't accept the premises, right? Very often you might look at the premises and see one of them and you say, that's just not true. Okay, but you got to sort of do something non-intuitive. You've got to ignore your instinct, and you've got to at least temporarily accept the fact that the premises are true. Now, in this argument, it's very easy to do so because the premises are true, right? Our social distancing practice has been placed not just for months, but close to a year. And during that time, the number of deaths of coronavirus has certainly gone up into the millions, right? 500,000 right here in the United States. Okay, so, but even if you had doubts on a premise, for the test of validity, you accept them and then decide, can you still reject the conclusion? In other words, if I accept that harsh social distancing practices have been in place for months, which I do because it's true, and if I accept that during that time the number of deaths of coronavirus has gone up, must I accept the conclusion that harsh social distancing practices are not stopping the spread of coronavirus? And the answer to that question is clearly yes, right? If you have any background knowledge on the whole concept behind social distancing, it was never meant to stop coronavirus in its tracks, right? It was meant to so-called flatten the curve, to make sure that there's not too many cases of corona at one particular time, so it won't overwhelm the healthcare system. Okay, so by its very nature, the number of deaths would go up, but they would go up more slowly, so that hopefully there would be fewer deaths overall because we'd be able to give people medical attention, right? So the very fact that I can accept the premises and reject the conclusion means this argument is not valid. Okay, so this argument is no good. We can reject this argument because it is not valid. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily that the conclusion is false. It just means that this argument does not provide enough information to get you to accept that conclusion. Okay, now, but it could be that I actually translated that argument poorly, right? I took the original argument, right, the original prose argument, and I translated it into two premises, but there's actually a hidden premise in that argument. Okay, hidden premise, Aristotle referred to it as an enthymeme, but for here you could just think of it as it's a premise that is implied but not stated outright in the argument, right? We still have our two original premises, but there's a hidden premise here that would make the argument valid, right? That hidden premise is that social distancing practices should lead to an immediate reduction in deaths from coronavirus. Okay, and if I have this new premise, then if I accept these three premises, then the conclusion, then I do have to accept the conclusion, right? If I accept that harsh social distancing practices have been in place for months, and I accept that during that time the number of deaths has gone up, and I accept that social distancing practices should lead to an immediate reduction in deaths from coronavirus, then I must accept the conclusion. This is now a valid argument. Okay, but there's a second test of the strength of an argument, and that is the test of soundness. Okay, and soundness is, if before I said, you know, for the test for validity, you need to temporarily accept the premises as true. Okay, for the test of soundness, you no longer do that. This is a two-step process. Okay, and in this step, you actually do look at each premise to see if it's true or not, or at least if it's something a reasonable person can reject. Okay, and as I said, the first two premises are true, right? Social distancing has been around for close to a year, deaths have gone up, but for the same reason I was able to accept the previous version of this argument as invalid, I can reject this third premise, right? This hidden premise, right? Because as I said, social distancing was not meant to lead to an immediate reduction in deaths. It was just meant to flatten the curve, lower deaths over time, et cetera. Okay, so, and if I can reject just one premise in an argument, then the entire argument is not sound. So what have we done through that exercise, right? Well, we've gone through every one of these components of critical thinking, right? We engaged in analysis of an argument. So we worked through argumentation, but in order to do so, we needed to translate the original prose argument into structured statements. So we needed our language skills. Okay. Now, that analysis used the rules of logic, the testing for an argument for validity and soundness, and it was able to dismiss that argument as either invalid or unsound using background knowledge, my understanding of what flattening the curve was all about. Okay, persuasive communication, a little less so, but as I mentioned, there was a sort of passionate component of that argument that we had to sort of see through. So I'd say persuasive communication played at least a small role in our analysis. And as I said in the beginning, I'm guessing many of you looked at the original argument and either accepted it or dismissed it, probably dismissed it out of hand, right? And that's our bias. That's because we have an existing belief in sort of what coronavirus is all about, it was very easy for us to accept or reject that premise without thinking about it. But the exercise I just went through, the whole argument analysis, that's something you do when you think critically about something, right? You temporarily put aside your biases because you know what? Going through that analysis, you might discover something you believed is not true, or at least is questionable, or at least something that is worth some scrutiny and some analysis using these tools of critical thinking. Okay, so I'm going to segue for the last part of this presentation. Then, as I said, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A to talk about teaching critical thinking. I've been told that there's many educators in this group, or students as well. So I just want to highlight some other research that came out of the book. The first utilizes the work of a critical thinking researcher called Robert Ennis, who indicated that there's 3 ways critical thinking is taught. And again, this is different in different countries. In the US, for instance, there's a general approach to critical thinking where you have an actual critical thinking course, right? A course called critical thinking. And that in the US, we generally do in higher education. Many colleges and universities have a critical thinking course, often taught by a member of the philosophy department, but not always. But then you have 2 ways of integrating critical thinking into the teaching of other subjects, right? Subjects like language or math or science or history, right? One is called the immersion process, where critical thinking is integrated into the curriculum, but it's taught implicitly. This would be, for instance, a science teacher teaching complex science material might assume that critical thinking concepts are coming along for the ride, and that are being learned through osmosis. And this is the way we teach critical thinking in K-12 in the US, which is we don't really teach it, right? We teach our subjects, and since those subjects involve thinking about things, we assume critical thinking is sort of being picked up along the way. In contrast, there's a method called infusion, where you actually explicitly teach critical thinking concepts in the course of teaching traditional course material. Okay? And as it turns out, that the worst way to teach critical thinking is how we teach it most of the time in the US. We teach it through the immersion method. This is why 99% of teachers from kindergarten up through graduate school will tell researchers that they prioritize teaching critical thinking. It's the most important thing they do. But 3/4 of employers say that the students they hire don't have those skills. So the immersion system just does not work particularly well. General system works a little bit better, but in fact, the infusion system, where you teach critical thinking explicitly, turns out to be the most effective means of teaching. That's one of the research findings, that critical thinking is best taught within the general curriculum, and it is best taught explicitly. Okay, and I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. Also, as I mentioned, like those critical thinking skills, like the ones we went through in that example, it turns out those are actually relatively easy to learn the knowledge behind. I could teach everybody here the rules of informal argumentation in a couple of hours. It's not that complicated, but it is complicated to apply that to the wide range of situations that logical thinking is required for. In that case, you need to give students substantial opportunities to practice those skills. It's called deliberate practice that's very guided into explicitly practicing critical thinking skills like logic and argumentation. Okay? And you also have to understand that getting enough practice can take a long time. There's one researcher who claims critical thinking is similar to being a sort of top-notch athlete or musician. It takes 10,000 hours to get really good at. Now, other people have disputed, that 10,000 hour mark for not just for critical thinking, but for all fields. But at the very least, I think it's fair to say you cannot become a skilled critical thinker by taking one course on the subject, right? You need to apply those skills over and over again in multiple situations for hours, for days, for weeks, for months, for years, right? So becoming a skilled critical thinker is a sort of, if not a lifetime practice, it's something that you need to incorporate into your life so that you can have ample opportunities to apply those skills in multiple parts of real life. Now, after publishing this book last year, the next step in my research was to determine, well, these are general principles. How do you apply them? How do you apply them in the classroom? How do you apply them in, either sort of K-12 or higher ed, and really anywhere in the world? And this is done through a set of what I call high leverage practices. Okay, these are teaching practices that provide a substantial, I don't know if you sort of use a similar phrase in Pakistan, but sort of bang for the buck. They give you a lot for a lot for a little, right? Applying these practices at key points in the curriculum can give you an enormous return in terms of student development of critical thinking skills. What are some of those high leverage practices? Well, I talked about, a couple of them. One is critical thinking should be integrated into the curriculum and taught explicitly. Okay, not sort of assumed to come along for the ride. Students must be given ample opportunities to perform deliberate practice. Okay, some other ones that are in a list I'll send you a link to, but metacognition, to be able to understand your own thinking. Metacognition is sort of thinking about your own thinking, knowing what's going on in your head, be able to sort of like, explicitly follow these processes and do them in your own head. Also, inspiration. If it turns out you do need 10,000 hours or even 5,000 hours or 2,000 hours, no single class is going to give you 2,000 hours of classroom time and homework time, right? So you to practice critical thinking skills. So you must inspire students to do critical thinking on their own, okay? That's inspiration. You must give them the opportunities to see the benefits of it, so they'll go out and do that when they're making life decisions, when they're reading the newspaper, when they're participating in politics, etc. And the last one I won't dwell on too much, but this draws from a philosophical school called pragmatism that John Dewey was a practitioner of. It's actually the only major school of philosophy to originate in the United States. And that one sort of assumes that students will act on something that creates doubt in their minds. If you start a class by doing something that show them a strange scientific phenomena or something, or ask them open-ended questions, or give them puzzles without obvious answers, right? Or that challenge their intuitions, this will inspire them to think because they want to get rid of that doubt, okay? But you need to channel that doubt in productive ways by thinking critically. Okay, so let me just give you a few examples and then we'll sort of move on to Q&A. Some of what I call high leverage content areas. To teach critical thinking as part of different subjects does not require you to teach critical thinking every single day for every single subject, right? There are certain topics that lend themselves to teaching key critical thinking concepts. For instance, in math, going back to sort of elementary school, when you dealt with sets, right? Triangles, squares, circles, rectangles, right? Organize them based on their property, right? Well, all squares are quadrilaterals. Squares and rectangles are both quadrilaterals, right? Well, that's categorical reasoning, right? A key logic skill, right? All A's are B's, some A's are not B's, etc. And that's something you teach fifth graders when you're teaching them about shapes or sets, right? That's something you can introduce them very early, right? In a language class or a history class, when you're teaching people to analyze a text or analyze a historical document or analyze the news, right? You could teach them about arguments, because all those things, newspapers, editorials, political speeches, nonfiction text, even fiction text, right? They all have statements which are premises leading to conclusions, right? there is a logical element to every editorial you read. There's a logical element to every speech you hear. There's a logical element to, when I was looking at slides in the previous talk, to kind of quotes that were up there from previous leaders in Pakistan, right? There are statements that, much like my coronavirus statements, can be translated into a logical argument. So these are skills you could teach students while you're teaching them to understand how to analyze a text, analyze a newspaper story, right? Science, I sort of describe science as its great breakthrough is it sort of minimizes confirmation bias through a set of methodologies, but also cultural elements that's designed to not have people fall prey to believing things they want to believe, right? So that could be taught in the concept of, in the context of teaching science, and even technology, which is an increasingly popular subject, that there students are thinking logically, right? When you create a program or a flow chart, you're constructing kind of logical arguments based on programming statements, which is great, right? So for that, you just have to get students to realize that that all arguments, whether or not they have anything to do with technology, right? Again, newspaper articles, texts, decisions about what car to buy, those can be also analyzed using the logical structure that they're already familiar with. Okay, so these are sort of, we've walked through sort of concepts of critical thinking, where critical thinking originated, how it can be applied, that it can be taught, that it can be defined. And since it can be taught, I provided some research-based methods of best practices on teaching the subject. So, I want to leave you, I'll kind of leave the slide up, but I'll also, at some point be happy to just turn it off if you want to just sort of talk face-to-face for the rest of this presentation. But, my site, jonathanhaber.org, has links to my books and all the various things we've been talking about. So you can go there as a sort of one-stop shop. If you're interested in those high leverage critical thinking practices, I have a site or part of another site that's dedicated to them. And I have a link here for that if there's any educators there are interested in sort of delving into that a little more deeply. And if you like that coronavirus example, I have another site called logiccheck.net that applies a variety of critical thinking principles to a range of news stories. I would say probably the bulk of them are domestic or US based, but not all of them. And the principles, as said, are hopefully universal. So with that, I will sort of turn it over. I don't know if I can keep the slide up and also see the chat. So if there are already questions in chat, either somebody can read those or I can stop sharing and I can look at the chat. But let's move on to Q&A. And again, I'll pop that, I could pop that slide on the screen if people want to still kind of take down those URLs.
Thank you, Mr. Jonathan, for your wonderful and very informative and intellectual presentation. I learned quite a lot, actually. So now I would request the participants, if there are any questions, you can please unmute your mic and perhaps ask the questions, or maybe if you're unable to speak, you can tap them down and I will
May I ask a question here?
Of course, yep.
Okay, thank you. First of all, let me extend my deep thanks to all those who have organized this online webinar, and I'm very glad that we are actually having access to such a remarkable scholarship who has been speaking on a very important topic of critical thinking. I have actually although I have a couple of observations, but I would first of all, ask you one question, which is based upon my personal experience of 18 years of teaching at public sector college, and I have been teaching the subject of economics. And you have very rightly said that it's not a kind of thing that you can teach critical thinking in one lecture and you can actually do it in 1 hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours. It sometimes requires thousands of hours. Sometimes it requires 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. I mean, it's a long, ongoing process through which you finally, somehow reach to certain, critical thinking levels through which you actually see through different stuffs, different, literature from the critical lens. And even myself, I myself actually, have actually experienced it, that over the period of so many, years, I have finally reached to this certain level where I have actually started, observing things and reading stuff through critical lens. Let me ask you one question. Since we live in a kind of, we all actually, live in specific legal, social arrangement. I mean, we are governed by certain legal, regimes. At the same time, we are also governed by certain, social norms and social values, which are dominant in certain society, in certain settings. There are certain sensitivities on the part of society, which are called, meta sensitivities. In our part of the world, what I have experienced, there has always been big barrier, big, obstacle, or big impediment on the way to any critical thinking in the name of certain social sensitivities. And I think you might understand what I'm trying to refer here. There are certain, laws, and there are certain, social, norms on the part of our largest social understanding and social sensitivities that simply, put great barrier. And I can refer here one professor who was basically, professor of English literature, who used to teach at Public Sector College in Bhavalpur, which is in southern part of the Punjab. And he was actually, killed by his own student in the classroom by actually, declaring him a kind of person who was somehow, we can say that he was actually, doing something or teaching something which was not, approved by their, certain social sensitivities. I mean, this incident may also be seen with certain incident that has taken place in France. So, I mean, there are certain, similarities in this. I mean, those professors or those teachers who want to, who sometimes, try to, explicitly, the thing which you have, in your presentation, you have mentioned that explicit way of teaching critical thinking and implicit way. Implicit way is ongoing process, and we try to, utilize it, but I think implicit way is somehow less productive. And explicit way is a bit difficult. When you try to explicitly go for the critical thinking, it becomes a kind of situation where you sometimes find yourself in a very difficult situation. Even sometimes you get frightened that there might be some kind of backlash. So listening your presentation, which is without any doubt scholarly rich presentation, and you have your own way of looking at India. You have your own long experience of teaching stuff through critical lens. May I ask you, how, when you are living in a kind of society which is a hybrid democratic society, which has very authoritarian sort of trends and values, and how, when you are perhaps one in thousands of the people who are basically propounding such kind of things, how someone can actually enhance his or her agency being in the profession of teaching, and particularly when we are doing even research, how we can actually somehow overcome our own inner unseen fears or something like that. Thank you very much. I hope I have actually asked the question. You might have.
It's a great question. Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. And I think if I could sort of kind of paraphrase it back to you, it's, teaching critical thinking is potentially dangerous in a situation where people are asked to analyze things that are considered sort of have very, very highly protected social norms. And I think that's true across the world, in terms of, like, if you're applying critical thinking to certain topics, notably politics and religion, right, then you are playing a potentially dangerous game, right? More so in some places than others. I'd say, fortunately in the US, there's not been kind of violence associated with kind of teaching critical thinking about certain subjects, but there is hostility. right? I think that you certainly get sort of segments of the population that either because of religious or political beliefs feel that critical thinking is a threat because it's asking you to question those beliefs. And I would say, you know, that's a kind of legitimate fear in that, you know, people who think for themselves or understand or have mastered the critical thinking tool set, certainly, you know, there's no necessarily restriction on how to apply it. And, you know, so it would not surprise me if people who were taught to think critically in the context of an economics course or a philosophy course or a science course might apply those universal skills to things that you know other members of society would find troubling. But at the same time, I would guess, you know, in a society like Pakistan, there are certain subjects that are considered very risky to question beliefs from. But at the same time, you have a modern scientific society with the university system. You know, no one's saying don't teach, when you teach programming, don't, you know, don't use logic, because somebody might apply the rules of logic to think about a taboo subject, right? You know, that they want professors to teach sort of global high quality research, and you know, universities across the world do. So to a certain extent, you know, if you're teaching critical thinking in the context of economics, for example, you know, using the practices that I talked about that would involve, and again, I'm no economist, so I'll be kind of making pulling some examples out of the air, but, you know, certainly you have to analyze text, right? You have to read articles, analyze them. Those articles contain or contemporary events that have to do with the economy, right? Those articles contain arguments. Those arguments have to be translated and broken down into premises and conclusions. You could do that implicitly and just assume students get that this is an argument. That's not very effective. Or you could do it explicitly. Let's take a look at the argument inside this article. What are the premises? What are the conclusions? And by the way, you can use this whenever you read an economics article or whenever you read any article. You know, similarly, if you're analyzing quantitative information, as obviously you do in economics, there's sort of mathematical fallacies that people fall prey to, you know, sort of confusing correlation and causation, for example. That's a universally applicable skill that's highly relevant to economics. And yes, somebody could potentially understand that there's people should not confuse correlation and causation and apply it to something that could get them in trouble. But, you know, that's no reason not to teach them the difference in correlation. In fact, I would guess no university has ever said don't teach our students the difference between correlation and causation in any subject that's relevant to. So I would say, you know, the skill set can be applied to anything, you know, and I would say, you know, most educators, unless you're sort of, you know, in some kind of educational situation where you're trying to consciously sort of go against societal norms and teach students how to fight against them, you could still give them the tools to do, you know, anything with their life. They could think through their beliefs and, you know, decide to keep them. They could think through their beliefs and try to reject them. But I think doesn't preclude, and I'm guessing no one's telling you not to teach the scientific method, not to teach, you know, sort of the rules of causation, et cetera, in any of your disciplines. So I think I would recommend that don't hesitate to teach these skills, but teach them in the context of your own subject matter. And then, you know, let students take those skills that are universally applicable and do what they want with them. I guess the other thing I point out is, you know, the kind of tendency to sort of like separate thinking and belief is really misguided, you know. So obviously, you know, when it leads to violence, it's horribly misguided. But, you know, historically, if you think of the whole concept of theology, for example, or political philosophy, that, you know, in places like China go back to Confucius, right? Those are rigorous intellectual pursuits that are designed to help you kind of firm up your beliefs. I have a friend who's a minister in the town I live in, and she kind of talked about theology as loving God with your mind, right? So there's really, I don't see a distinction necessarily between thinking and sort of faith in a political system or faith in a set of religious beliefs, but I understand, you know, there are certainly places where those two are considered in opposition. So I guess my sort of general sort of sense is teach kids how to think critically, give them the tool set, teach them to think for themselves. Yes, you know, some of them may apply those in ways that are risky. You know, potentially some of them may apply those in ways that put others at risk. But, you know, people are at risk anyway, because, you know, if you live in a society where people are killed for not teaching the right things, I mean, that's what I presume everybody here doesn't want to live in a society like that. And one way to do it is to get people to come to a reasoned belief, or a reason for all their beliefs, including ones that might ultimately be unprovable. Does that answer your question there?
Sir, I have a question related to this. As you
Yep.
said,
I'm sorry, you've muted.
if someone is a critical thinker and his or her environment don't allow him or her to be like he is now, so don't you think this create a conflict between that individual and his environment? And sir, my question is how to manage that conflict. If I am thinking critically and I evaluate everything in critical manner, and my environment don't allows me to do this, as if I talk about in Pakistani context, in a majority of schools and colleges don't allow students to question things. So my question is how to manage that conflict that develop because of this situation.
That's another great question. Yeah, and I think, you know, if Pakistan has a school system that's much more about sort of rote learning of knowledge, or not questioning, or the teacher as authority figure, that presents a challenge. I guess the first thing I'd say is, you know, my guess is this conflict is already in place, right? I'm guessing that you know, students who are taught, you know, to unquestionably believe things, there's a there's probably already a conflict going on in their own heads. And I would say that's probably a less healthy conflict because they don't know what to do with it, right? They don't know how to process that information to figure out what revealed truths are true or they should believe, you know, if they're just asked to accept all of them. So I'd say, you know, it's not like we're moving from a situation where everybody is sort of content and happy, believing what they're told, to now being sort of distraught because they're questioning those beliefs. I would guess most people who are told to, you know, think certain things and not others have a natural inclination to disbelieve them. In fact, even going back before Dewey to a philosopher called Charles Saunders Peirce, who was the originator of that sort of pragmatic philosophy I talked about. He talked about different ways to form beliefs, right? One is called an a priori system, where you just believe what you already believe, right? You know, you accept information that conforms to what you already believe and you reject information that doesn't, right? That's called confirmation bias, and that's global, right? That's a global problem. We see it everywhere. There's also, you can form beliefs by authority, right? Believe whatever the teacher tells you, believe whatever the government tells you, believe whatever your parents tell you, and that is the truth, right? But there's another way of thinking called tenacity, which is rebelling against authority. And I'm guessing that also is universal, that you have people who simply not just don't believe what they're told, but they believe the opposite of what they're told, just, you know, out of sort of out of rebellion, right? And all three of those methods, you know, confirmation bias, a priori reasoning, authority, and tenacity, right? Those are all ways you can form beliefs, right? We've all done them, right? We form beliefs based on what we learned from our parents or our society, you know, authority figures. We formed our own identities, often by rebelling against certain of those beliefs. But none of those are necessarily the best way to get to the truth, right? Critical thinking is a way of forming beliefs that is good at getting at, better than those other ways of getting at the truth. Okay, so in a way you have to kind of balance all those things. There's room in the world for authority, right? We're a nation of laws. I'm a parent. I want my children to kind of do what I say in certain circumstances. Although as they get older, I want them to understand why they have certain rules placed upon them, and even give them the ability to discuss and debate those rules. So I would say you're not necessarily creating new conflict, except maybe among those who were prone to believe authority unquestionably, and now they feel challenged. I'm guessing most people question sort of revealed truths, received wisdom from authority figures, and they suppress that, or they have their own internal lives in which is separate from what they proclaim when they talk to others. So I think this conflict that you're already talking about already exists in most people. I think critical thinking just provides a way of moving that from a sort of murky conflict that they don't know what to do about, to giving them a set of tools that allow them to process those sort of conflicts better. So probably not a solution, but it's a way of, I would say, hopefully in the long term, it becomes a healthier outlet for the very conflict you're talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Jonathan. That was a wonderful explanation. So I have one more participant that wanted to ask a question, and the question is, how important collaborative learning is for improving critical thinking skills? So this is a question, and I would like to answer you to answer this. And then I also have a question that, if we had time, I'd like to ask.
Of course, yeah, I'm happy to stay as long as anybody has questions. Yeah, that's a great question. I think collaboration is actually what we call in the US the 4 C's, right? Critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, and communication. They're considered 4 21st century skills, and very much, the notion is that these are skills students need to develop. But they're not necessarily distinct, right? That collaboration and critical thinking take place whenever you have an argument with somebody else, right? Because an argument is fundamentally a collaborative enterprise. You're both trying to answer a question. You're both trying to solve a problem. You might have completely different answers to that question. You might have completely different ways of getting to that solution, and you may never resolve it, but you're still involved with a cooperative enterprise. So, I'd say collaboration is deeply bound up with critical thinking. Also, there's certain theories, if you read the critical thinking research, that's asking, is thinking even an individual act, or do we think socially? Are we really only thinking when we interact with other people, right? And I would say one of the, I'm just gonna call it a problem, but one of the challenges of critical thinking is not just the research, but the philosophy, going back to Aristotle, tends to be about perfecting an individual's own thinking, right? The last question we talked about, an isolated individual sort of thinking through, sort of the received wisdom that they've gotten, and that all happening inside somebody's head. But generally, that's not how it works, right? You talk to others who share your beliefs, or share your questions, or have your questions, or you debate people who believe the opposite of you do, or you participate in forums like this one, where you talk about all these concepts, right? So in that case, thinking is a social act. And the reason I say it's kind of a problem is that most of the literature and exercises and activities are still about perfecting, the sort of thinking processes of an individual. Thinking as a group act is less well understood, but it's no less important. So I would say, certainly if you think of argumentation, right, you can argue with yourself, but more frequently substantive arguments are done with other people. So in that case, thinking is an external and collaborative act. And I'd say even in simply the teaching of critical thinking, whenever I've taught to students in a classroom, there have been collaborative activities, right? Here's an argument, map it out, or write it up as translated into an informal argument, and you're going to work in pairs, or you're going to work in groups. So there's a range of collaborative teaching methodologies that very much fit into sort of explicit ways of teaching critical thinking skills. So I would say they are not in conflict. In some cases, just teaching students, good manners, sharing workload, leading groups, etc. Those aren't necessarily, critical thinking focused, just the same way subtraction doesn't necessarily have as much sort of critical thinking content associated with it as does things like SATs, like that example I gave you before. But there is a role for it, and I would say you should treat it as sort of one more piece of the toolkit. Okay, and you also
thank you, Mr. Jonathans. I think that answers it. So I have more of a comment than a question, actually. And before I think we begin to teach critical thinking, which is essential, make no mistake, but I think we need to teach, because prior to this question, there was a very distinguished professor who asked you about the meta norms of the Pakistani society and how we have things that you cannot touch and all these things. And it reminded me that how we need to teach tolerance first, because even the US is facing this issue of free speech on campuses, and there are individuals, if you claim to be in any other group that offends the opposite, then you're risking their reactions, which could be aggressive and in many ways. So I think I think societies in general and all over the world are less tolerant in these times. So I think we need to teach more tolerance and how we should be at least acceptable in some manner to these different ideas. For instance, if somebody has a criticism on my ideals and what I follow, so that's perhaps their own critical thinking, and that's not an issue with me as an individual. So I think we need to teach more tolerance in students, and we need to promote tolerance in campuses as well. This is why we have issues whenever there is a professor or a student asking or perhaps doing something that is rather different from the ordinary. We face these kind of abrupt aggressive reactions. So I think tolerance is an essential key. So I will come back to the participant in the chat room who have asked as a bit of a lengthy question.
I just want to only supplement your observation, Mr. Feroz. And you have talked about tolerance that we should promote and we should teach. I think that the word tolerance has a lot to do with the overall legal arrangement of any state. You see, there are certain implicit ways of it, either promoting or hindering tolerance. You see, in our society, the role of state has consistently been to the advantage of those who are showing vigilantism. Remember, this vigilantism is a kind of, implicit approval by the, by the specific legal lacunas and legal regimes in which there are certain gaps and certain problems, which are actually, promoting a kind of sentiment on the part of people. I think you are a student of university. You might have actually experienced and observed for the past, few years that how one particular, group simply, achieved highest level of, subscription from masses, and then those masses gathered on the major intersectional point of two big cities, Islamabad and Rawalpindi. They staged a big sit-in, and then they actually succumbed to the government, the then government, who had to accept their demands. And then that situation did not stop. Even last year we have witnessed it. This indicates that how implicitly certain legal lacunas are actually exploited by the state to the advantage of certain kind of policy instruments and tools. Remember, I think we should not simply throw them away, and we should not pass our judgments in a very very naive manner that we should promote. I think we can only, talk about these things, that these type of things are now, political instruments in the hand of specific, I mean, what I call it, the hybrid, democratic regimes, and where law itself becomes a kind of handy tool, and where law in forms of a kind of what I call it, I mean, law becomes a kind of justification for vigilantism. I mean, this is big strength on the part of certain authoritarian regimes. I mean, that suits them. So I think we should look at it from a very broader perspective as well. I don't know whether my comment has I mean, made certain point here or not, but I think this is how I look at it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think tolerance is I mean, for starters, when I showed you that three-part model, tolerance can be considered a critical thinking disposition, right? You must be tolerant to the opinions of others. I think, both sets of comments are very apt. Also, though, you have to some extent, you also have to tolerate, we all live in societies that have certain norms and rules and laws, and they are there for a reason. They're not necessarily there to be rejected or dismissed out of hand. In fact, they should be interrogated, but at the same time, they should be you should treat them with respect, like you should treat all ideas with respect, right? Like I had listened to an interesting interview the other day right here in the US. We very much treasure our freedom of speech, right? There are laws in place that the government can, not restrict political speech. And that's great, right? So, but, as opposed to Europe, for example, where certain opinions can be outlawed and have been outlawed. But in exchange for that, that means that, what was just talked about, the sort of mobbing and canceling at American universities, that's an example of citizens taking it upon themselves to censor each other. Right? You don't see that in places where the government does have the ability to censor, because that's where the power of censorship takes place. Now, it's easy to say, in fact, it was easy to say until a couple of years ago, it is inherently superior to not live in a society where the government has, legal powers to censor. And I think I still sort of believe that, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that censorship goes away. In our society, in America, censorship has just sort of moved elsewhere. Now, these are all interesting ideas to interrogate, right? They are deeply bound up with the American social norms, especially ones involving freedom and freedom of speech. In Pakistan, as you said, you've got a sort of mixed system, it has democratic elements, it has non-democratic elements, it has secular elements, certainly in a university system and an education system, but it also has religious elements. And I think those are all things that they're all important subjects. They deserve to be thought about. They deserve to be kind of interrogated in some way, but at least thought about. And I would say, from my perspective, it's showing them respect. I think I have much more sort of respect for someone who's come to their religious beliefs by thinking about them, of which I include myself, right? So I think, that if you want to change a society for the better, you can't do, again, what we've seen on American college campuses, just sort of dismiss the past and decide everything is terrible or come to snap judgments. You need to treat things respectfully. There's a critical thinking principle I recommend in all my writing called the principle of charity. Right? The principle of charity asks you to engage with the strongest version of somebody's argument, right? Rather than just pounce on a weak one or invent straw man or do any other ways to sort of not really engage, pretend you're engaged if you're not really engaged with somebody. If you think about it, if people were engaging with each other's strongest arguments, you would be having debates over difficult political situations, because there are probably reasons for some of the things in laws in Pakistan that might not seem fair. There might be reasons behind people's behaviors on college campuses that seem intolerant, right? Doesn't mean you have to accept them or come to a conclusion that, they're right, but if you engage with those ideas in their strongest form, then you can form your own strongest beliefs for and against them, so I do think thinking about things is the pathway forward, even though I fully understand that's extraordinarily difficult in many situations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Haber. We are exceeding time, so I think we'll move on to the conclusion. We do have 2 or 3 questions in the chat box, and the participants who've asked those, I would really appreciate if you email your questions to Mr. Haber, and he can answer you probably, because I don't think we have time for such comprehensive questions right now.
Yeah, happy to. Let me put my email address back on the screen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Haber. We'd highly appreciate.
Of course, yeah. Here's my email address again. It's jonathan@degreeoffreedom.org. I'll leave that up if anybody wants to send me. And if anybody thinks of a question afterwards and wants to talk about, I'd be happy to talk. I really appreciate all the thoughtful discussion throughout this event, and I want to thank everybody also for including me in it. And getting a chance to talk to you. I've enjoyed every minute of it. I've been looking forward to it all week, and I could see why. So thanks to all the organizers, and thank you for all who participated.
Thank you so much for all your insights, and thank you so much for all your insights and all your viewpoints that you put forward. We really appreciate your time. And moving on, we now have President of PAS, Mr. Ehsanullah Rahim. He's a professor of political science, PhD scholar, presently serving as Principal Government Degree College, Havelia. I would like to invite him to offer his vote of thanks to the speakers and also share his concluding remarks. Over to you, Mr. Ehsanullah Rahim.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, sir. You are quite audible, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Ji. Thank you very much for sparing some time. First of all, being president of PAS, I would like to have thanks for 2 scholars, Dr. Sadia Bajiba and Jonathan Haber. It has enriched a lot. Actually, the major task of our Professor Association for Student Services is to provide and to enrich students' knowledge related with different aspects. Particularly today we have got a lot, and it has both the scholars, they have given a lot of knowledge related with critical thinking. So far as the view of Dr. Sadia Bajiba is concerned, she talked about student politics and critical thinking, and a very good perspective, historical perspective of Pakistan's politics, the student politics in Pakistan. No doubt it has enriched a lot our knowledge. But one of the very important question is that since the inception of the country, we have been, the society and the students, they have been under the clutches of establishment. And the entire academia, the atmosphere of academia, that is not permitting students to take part in politics. Students, they have been, many a time, they have been exploited by the political parties, because the parties itself, they have been either they belong to certain types of enclaves. When we talk about the feudal enclaves, or we may talk about the authoritarian enclaves. So therefore, students, they are there is an elite politics, and our students, they have been the victim of this politics. However, it was a very good viewpoint of Dr. Sadia Bajwa, and we have got a lot. Secondly, I would like to talk about that in order to another viewpoint, what I have noticed is that we have been hybrid regime, and our society since its inception, and our country since its inception, has been a state, we may call it a hybrid regime. It has not yet developed any kind of democratic culture, and there is always a monologue, or rather a dialogue. So therefore, the student politics has been banned since years. Even the Supreme Court, they have also banned it. And we have, whenever there are admissions in our colleges, in our universities, there is a paper, as she talked about, that you have to sign that there should be no politics in academia. And whenever we'll find them, they will be punished for that. So this is what is the story of Pakistan's, the student of Pakistan. And this has badly affected the due right of students, because it has developed a kind of hatred, and legally the students, they are not, at their issues, they are not being addressed in such a society. So therefore, they then find some illegitimate ways in order to address the issues. They became the, you may say that they play in the hands of politicians, so they could not develop their skills. Secondly, so far as the second speaker is concerned, Professor Jonathan Haber, I'm very thankful to you. I have listened a lot, and it has also enriched our students' minds. That is related with critical thinking. No doubt in it, one of the very important points that was in that viewpoint, it was the commitment on the part of teacher, commitment on the part of the person who would like to develop his critical thinking. And no doubt that the society, some of the questions were related with society. We are living in a conservative society, and we have a conservative society. But for the conservative society, it is very important that there should be work on critical thinking. There should be something, a dialogue. The society must transform into a kind of society that there should be debates and dialogues between students, and to develop their logic and critical thinking. In such a way, they can help to transform the society into a different kind of society. For a change, it is very important, because you cannot change a conservative society into a modern society without critical thinking. So I would like to say thank to Mr. Jonathan Haber for such a remarkable viewpoint related with critical thinking, and some of the very important points that he shared, and the books related with critical thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hassan Rahim, for your concluding remarks, and for providing this platform to the students to connect with such speakers who come from a more informed place, and who enrich us with their knowledge and their expertise and their viewpoints. And I would also like to thank our participants who joined us in this webinar today to make this a success. Good night to everyone, and thank you again to the speakers and to the participants for being here with us today.
Okay, thank you, Ji, Dr. Shkil Saib. Thank you, Dr. Sadia. Thank you, Jonathan Haber.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good night. Good evening.
Okay, ji. Thank you.